The crystal chandelier cast rainbow fragments across the polished marble floor as I smoothed my hands down the silk of my wedding dress one final time. The Preston Military Club was everything I dreamed of for this day. Soaring ceilings decorated with American flags and portraits of decorated officers, mahogany tables gleaming under soft lighting, and windows overlooking the city skyline where my father once served. The florist had outdone herself with white roses and baby's breath, creating an atmosphere of elegant military tradition that would have made Dad proud. I should have been glowing with happiness. Instead, my stomach twisted with familiar knots as I watched my mother, Teresa Santos, glide through the reception hall like a general inspecting troops. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Clara, darling! Mrs. Richardson, one of Dad's old friends, wrapped me in a warm hug that smelled of lavender perfume. You look absolutely radiant. Your father would be so proud. Before I could respond, my mother materialized beside us, her smile sharp as a blade. Thank you, Margaret. Though I do hope Clara remembers to keep her shoulders back during the receiving line. Posture is everything when you're representing the Santos family name. The warmth drained from Mrs. Richardson's expression. She squeezed my hand once more before drifting away toward the bar, leaving me alone with my mother's critical gaze. The dress fits well enough, Mom continued, circling me like I was a cadet in inspection, though I still think you should have chosen something more traditional. That neckline is rather modern. I'd spent months searching for this dress, a classic A-line with delicate lace sleeves and a modest sweetheart neckline that made me feel beautiful and confident. Every bride deserves to feel perfect on her wedding day. But under my mother's scrutiny, I felt like I was wearing a costume that didn't quite fit. It's my wedding dress, Mom. I love it. She made a noise that wasn't quite agreement. Well, what's done is done. Just remember to behave with dignity tonight. There are distinguished guests here, real military officers who knew your father. They'll be watching how you conduct yourself. The implication hung in the air like smoke. That I was somehow prone to embarrassing behavior, that I needed to be reminded to act appropriately at my own wedding. My fingers tightened around my bouquet until the stems bit into my palm. Clara! Relief flooded through me as Miguel appeared at my side, handsome in his black tuxedo with a white rose boutonniere. His warm brown eyes found mine immediately, and some of the tension melted from my shoulders. My husband. Even thinking the word sent a flutter through my chest. You look incredible, he murmured, pressing a soft kiss to my temple. How are you holding up? Perfect, I lied, leaning into his solid presence, just greeting everyone. Miguel nodded politely to my mother. Mrs. Santos, thank you again for helping to make this day so special. Of course. I only hope Clara appreciates the connections we have provided. General Ramirez himself is here tonight. He served with my late husband. Such an honor for our family. The way she said our family somehow managed to exclude me entirely. More guests began filtering in, and I lost myself in the familiar ritual of handshakes, hugs, and congratulations. My family embraced me with genuine warmth, his mother fussing over my dress, and his father joking that Miguel had married up. My college friends squealed over every detail, from my hair to my shoes to the elegant centerpieces. For a few precious moments, I felt like any other bride, cherished, celebrated, the star of my own story. Then Lucia arrived. My older sister swept into the hall like she was reviewing troops, her military dress uniform crisp and commanding. At 32, she'd already earned the rank of major in the Army Corps of Engineers, and she wore her achievements like armor. Dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, posture ramrod straight, she was everything our mother had wanted both her daughters to become. Clara, she said, giving me a brief, efficient hug. Congratulations. The venue looks good. Thank you for being here, Lucia. I know you're busy. Major Santos, Colonel Brennan, one of Dad's old colleagues, approached with his wife in tow. Heard about your promotion. Outstanding work on that infrastructure project in Afghanistan. And just like that, I became background scenery at my own wedding reception. Guests clustered around Lucia as she modestly accepted praise for her latest commendation. My mother beamed with pride, her chest literally puffing out as she basked in the reflected glory of her accomplished daughter. Such dedication, Mrs. Brennan gushed. Following in her father's footsteps, the family tradition of service continues. I stood 3 feet away in my wedding dress, invisible. Miguel's hand found mine, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Want to go check on the cake?" he whispered. I nodded gratefully, letting him guide me toward the far corner of the room where our 3-tier masterpiece waited on its designated table. The vanilla and strawberry layers looked perfect, topped with sugar flowers that matched my bouquet exactly. It was beautiful, personal, ours. "She doesn't mean to overshadow you," Miguel said quietly, following my gaze back toward Lucia's impromptu receiving line. "Yes, she does." The words slipped out before I could stop them. "I'm sorry, I don't mean to be bitter, it's just, this is my wedding day, you know? For once, couldn't I be the center of attention in my own family?" Miguel turned me to face him fully, his hands gentle on my shoulders. "You are the center of attention, my attention, and everyone who matters already knows what an incredible person you are. Your work with veterans' families, the way you've helped so many people rebuild their lives, that takes real courage, Clara. That matters." I wanted to believe him. But as I looked around the room at the military memorabilia, the uniformed guests, the way conversations naturally gravitated toward discussions of rank and service records, I felt like an imposter at my own celebration. Here I was, a community development coordinator who'd never served a day in the military, trying to convince everyone I belonged in a room full of heroes. The dinner chimes rang, and guests began moving toward their assigned tables. Time for the formal reception to begin. As I walked through the crowd on Miguel's arm, I held my head high and smiled until my cheeks ached. This was my wedding day. Whatever happened next, I was going to find a way to make it memorable. The string quartet's gentle melody filled the decorated alcove as I stood beside Miguel, his hand warm and steady in mine. Evening light filtered through the tall windows, casting everything in a golden glow that made the moment feel almost sacred. The officiant, Colonel Martinez, a family friend who'd served with my father, spoke about love, commitment, and the sacred bond of marriage with the gravity befitting his rank. "Do you, Miguel Alvarez, take Clara Santos to be your wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live?" "I do." Miguel's voice was strong and clear, his eyes never leaving mine. In his gaze, I saw our future stretching out before us. Quiet Sunday mornings, shared dreams, children who would grow up knowing they were wanted and loved unconditionally. When it was my turn to recite the vows, my voice only trembled slightly. "I do." The kiss was soft, perfect, and brief, appropriate for the formal military crowd watching our every move. Applause erupted from the seated guests, and for a moment, everything felt exactly as it should be. I was Mrs. Clara Alvarez now, starting a new life with a man who saw me, really saw me, and loved what he found. As we walked back down the makeshift aisle together, I caught sight of my mother in the front row. She was smiling, but it was her public smile, the one she wore for cameras and commanding officers. Behind her, Lucia nodded approvingly, as if I'd just completed a drill exercise to satisfactory standards. But in the third row, I spotted General Ramirez, the mysterious guest my mother had mentioned. He was older than I had expected, maybe 65, with silver hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades in service. When our eyes met, he smiled. Not the polite social smile most guests were wearing, but something warmer, more personal. Something that reminded me of my father. The receiving line moved quickly,
Handshakes, quick hugs, the usual congratulations about the beautiful ceremony and how handsome Miguel looked in his tux. I was settling into the rhythm of it when I heard my mother's voice drift over from where she was speaking to a cluster of her friends. Of course we're proud, she was saying, her tone carrying just far enough for me to catch. Though Clara never quite followed the family path, if you know what I mean, not like Lucia, who really honors her father's memory through her service. My smile faltered. Mrs. Patterson, who was complimenting my bouquet, noticed my distraction and glanced toward my mother's conversation. "I'm sure your father would be proud of both his daughters," she said diplomatically. "Yes," I managed. "I hope so." But the doubt had already crept in, cold and familiar. Dad had died when I was 15, a training accident that shattered our world in an instant. I'd grieved not just for the father I'd lost, but for all the conversations we'd never have, all the moments when I'd need his approval and wouldn't be able to get it. Had he expected me to follow Lucia into military service? Would he have been disappointed by my choice to work in community development instead? The receiving line finally ended, and Miguel and I were ushered toward the head table for dinner. The room looked spectacular in the evening light. Candles flickering on every table, the American flag prominently displayed behind the head table, and guests in their finest attire settling in for what promised to be an elegant evening.
Ladies and gentlemen, Colonel Martinez announced, his voice carrying easily through the room, please join me in welcoming Mr. and Mrs. Alvarez. More applause, and this time I managed a genuine smile. Miguel squeezed my hand under the table as the first course, a delicate soup with herbs, was served. Conversation flowed around us, a mixture of wedding small talk and military shop talk that I followed with one ear while trying to enjoy the moment. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, evaluated, measured against some invisible standard. When Captain Morrison complimented the flowers, I found myself explaining that I'd chosen them myself, as if I needed to prove I was capable of making decisions. When Mrs. Davis asked about our honeymoon plans, I felt compelled to mention that I'd organized everything, including the logistics of Miguel's time off from his teaching position. Clara always was the organized one, my mother commented from her seat nearby. Even as a child, always making lists and plans. Though sometimes I wondered if she spent so much time planning that she forgot to actually live. The words hit like a slap. Around us, conversation continued normally. I don't think anyone else caught the dig, but Miguel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Clara's organized because she's thoughtful. She thinks about other people's needs before her own. It's one of the things I love most about her. My mother's smile didn't waver. Of course, dear, I didn't mean anything by it. But we both knew she had. The soup course was cleared away, and the main course arrived. Perfectly cooked salmon with roasted vegetables that I barely tasted. I was too busy watching my mother hold court at the adjacent table, regaling guests with stories about Lucia's latest accomplishments, how she'd been commended by her commanding officer, how she'd volunteered for deployment when others shied away from the responsibility, how she embodied everything the Santos family stood for. "She's proud of Lucia," Miguel murmured, leaning close to my ear, "but that doesn't mean she's not proud of you too." I wanted to believe him, but as I watched my mother's animated gestures, the way her face lit up when discussing my sister's achievements, I couldn't help but notice the difference. When people asked about me, her answers were polite but brief, dutiful rather than enthusiastic. Clara works in community development. She helps families navigate social services. It's important work, of course. Always the pause, always the qualifier, as if my career needed to be justified, explained away, made acceptable to this audience of military professionals who understood real service, real sacrifice, real honor. The dinner plates were cleared away, and I felt my stomach begin to flutter with a familiar anxiety. Soon would come the toasts, the formal speeches where family members would stand before the assembled guests and share their thoughts about the happy couple. Miguel's father had already prepared remarks about gaining a daughter. His mother planned to welcome me officially into their family.
And my mother, well, she'd asked to speak as well. As the mother of the bride, it was traditional, expected. I just had to hope that surrounded by all these distinguished guests, she'd remember to be kind. The servers began setting up for dessert, and I saw Colonel Martinez checking his watch. Soon, very soon, I'd find out exactly what my mother really thought of me, delivered in front of everyone who mattered. I reached for Miguel's hand again, needing his steadiness more than ever. The clink of silverware against crystal glasses echoed through the reception hall as dessert was served and the formal toasts began. I sat straighter in my chair, hyper aware of every eye in the room as Colonel Martinez stepped up to the small podium near our head table. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I may have your attention," he began, his commanding voice easily filling the space. "As we celebrate the union of Clara and Miguel tonight, I think it's fitting to remember those who shaped these two remarkable individuals, particularly those who can't be with us." My breath caught. He was going to mention Dad. Lieutenant Colonel Roberto Santos was one of the finest officers I ever served with, Colonel Martinez continued, his tone reverent. A man of unshakable integrity, fierce loyalty, and deep love for his family. Roberto often spoke about his daughters, how proud he was of both Clara and Lucia, how he saw in them the qualities that make great leaders: compassion, intelligence, and moral courage. Scattered applause rippled through the room. I felt tears prick at my eyes, touched that Colonel Martinez would honor my father's memory this way. But even as warmth spread through my chest, I noticed the subtle shift in the room's attention. Heads turned slightly toward Lucia, who sat with military bearing, accepting the implied praise with modest dignity. "Of course we can see how Roberto's legacy lives on through Major Santos," he continued, gesturing toward my sister. "Her distinguished service record speaks for itself, following in her father's footsteps with honor and distinction." More applause, longer this time. Lucia inclined her head graciously, while my mother beamed with unmistakable pride. I clapped too, because that's what you do. But something cold settled in my stomach as I realized the direction this was heading. "And Clara," Colonel Martinez said, turning back to me with a kind smile, "has found her own way to serve, supporting our military families through her work in community development. Different paths, but both admirable in their own right." The applause for me was polite, appropriate, but noticeably briefer. I smiled and nodded my thanks, trying to ignore the way several guests were still glancing between Lucia and me, as if conducting some invisible comparison. As Colonel Martinez yielded the podium to Miguel's father, I heard the whispered conversations starting up around nearby tables. Not loud enough to be obvious, but just audible enough to catch fragments. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Such dedication to follow the family tradition. Takes real courage to volunteer for deployment. Always wondered why the younger daughter didn't serve. Different generation, I suppose. Softer work these days. Each comment landed like a small stone thrown at my confidence. Miguel's hand found mine under the table, his thumb tracing gentle circles across my knuckles, our private signal that he was there, that he saw me struggling, that he loved me regardless of what anyone else thought. Miguel's father delivered a heartfelt speech about gaining a daughter and watching his son find true love. His mother followed with sweet stories about our courtship and how I'd won over their entire family with my kindness and determination. Their words wrapped around me like a warm blanket, reminding me that I was loved, that I was worthy of celebration. But the military guests seemed restless during these civilian perspectives on love and marriage. I caught several checking their phones, others having quiet side conversations about deployment schedules and upcoming transfers. This crowd understood honor and duty and sacrifice, concepts they could measure in rank and medals and years of service. A school teacher praising his daughter-in-law's capacity for love didn't resonate the same way. Then General Ramirez stood up. The room went quiet instantly, all side conversations ceasing as if someone had thrown a switch. Even the servers paused in their duties, recognizing the presence of real authority. The general was an imposing figure, tall, silver-haired, with the kind of bearing that commanded respect without saying a word. But instead of approaching the podium, he simply raised his glass from his seat at table 6. "To Lieutenant Colonel Santos," he said, his voice carrying easily through the hushed room, "a brother-in-arms who gave his life in service to our country, and to his daughters, who honor his memory in their own ways." Every glass in the room lifted as we drank to my father's memory. The general's toast was brief but powerful, cutting through the earlier comparisons and complications with simple respect for the man who had shaped us both. When he sat back down, I caught his eye and mouthed, "Thank you." His slight nod in return felt like a benediction. The mood shifted again as the evening's entertainment began. A military band had been arranged, young soldiers who played with precision and enthusiasm, their music filling the hall with patriotic melodies that had guests swaying in their seats. Between songs, more informal toasts erupted from various tables as friends and colleagues shared memories and well wishes. Captain Harrison, one of Dad's old unit members, stood to share a story about my father's legendary poker games. Major Williams reminisced about Roberto's terrible singing voice, but unwavering optimism during difficult deployments. Each story painted a picture of a man beloved by his comrades. Funny, loyal, brave, deeply human. But with each military anecdote, I felt myself shrinking further into the background of my own celebration. These men had shared foxholes and mess halls and life-or-death situations with my father. Their memories were forged in the crucible of service, tested by fire, proven through sacrifice. What stories could I tell? That Dad helped me with algebra homework? That he taught me to drive in the empty parking lot behind the commissary? That he always made chocolate chip pancakes on Sunday mornings, even after the longest weeks? My memories felt small, domestic, insufficient in comparison. "You're doing it again," Miguel whispered, leaning close to my ear. "Doing what?" "That thing where you disappear inside your own head, where you start believing you don't measure up." Before I could respond, I heard my mother's voice calling for attention. She was standing now, elegant in her navy blue dress, holding a glass of champagne with the poise of someone accustomed to public speaking. The room quieted expectantly.
"Thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate Clara and Miguel," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent years as a military spouse, hosting dinners and organizing events. "It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces, people who knew my late husband, Roberto, who understand what family legacy means." My pulse quickened. There was something in her tone, a careful emphasis on certain words that made my skin prickle with foreboding. "Roberto was so proud of our family's tradition of service," she continued, her gaze sweeping the room with practiced ease. "He raised our daughters to understand duty, honor, and the importance of living up to one's potential." She paused, looking directly at Lucia, and her smile became radiant. "Lucia has exceeded every expectation. Major Santos embodies everything her father stood for: courage under pressure, dedication to country, leadership in the finest military tradition. She makes the Santos name proud every single day." The applause was thunderous. Lucia stood briefly, acknowledging the recognition with characteristic grace, before sitting back down. My mother basked in the reflected glory, her chest swelling with visible pride. Then she turned to look at me. "And Clara," she said, her voice taking on a different quality, still polite, still public appropriate, but somehow diminished. "Well, Clara has always been different. She chose her own path, as young people do these days." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Miguel's grip on my hand tightened. "While we hoped she might follow the family tradition of service," my mother continued, each word carefully chosen, precisely aimed, "she decided instead to pursue softer work, community development, helping people navigate social services. It's meaningful work, of course, though perhaps not what her father envisioned for his daughters. My face burned as if she'd slapped me in front of everyone. Around the room, I could see guests shifting uncomfortably, uncertain whether they were witnessing normal family teasing or something sharper, more cruel. But Clara has always been our... She paused, seeming to consider her words carefully. Our disappointment. The word hit the air like a gunshot. Complete silence fell over the reception hall. No clinking glasses, no rustling fabric, no quiet conversations, just the terrible, echoing weight of that single word, disappointment. Miguel started to rise from his chair, his face flushed with anger, but I caught his arm. This was my family, my humiliation to handle. Even as my heart shattered into pieces, some stubborn part of me refused to let my husband fight my battles in front of all these witnesses. My mother seemed to realize she'd gone too far because she quickly raised her glass with renewed brightness. But tonight isn't about the past. It's about celebrating Clara and Miguel's future together. To the happy couple. The applause was thunderous. Guests raised their glasses and murmured, "Cheers!" But the damage was done. I lifted my champagne flute with trembling fingers and forced myself to smile, to nod, to play the part of the grateful bride accepting her mother's blessing. Inside, I was dying. As conversations slowly resumed around the room, I excused myself to the ladies' room, needing a moment to collect the pieces of my dignity before they scattered completely across the polished floor. Standing in front of the ornate mirror, I stared at my reflection. The carefully applied makeup, the elegant dress, the fresh flowers in my hair. I looked like a bride. I looked happy and radiant and loved. I looked nothing like how I felt inside. The bathroom door opened behind me, and I straightened, preparing to paste on another fake smile for whoever was entering. But when I turned, I found myself face to face with General Ramirez. "Mrs. Alvarez, might I have a word?" I stood frozen in the ladies' room doorway, staring at General Ramirez. His presence filled the elegant space, tall, distinguished, with eyes that seemed to see straight through pretense to the truth underneath. For a moment, I wondered if I was hallucinating from the shock of my mother's public humiliation. "General," I managed my voice barely above a whisper. This is the ladies' room." A gentle smile creased his weathered face. "I know, but sometimes the most important conversations happen in the most unexpected places. Your father taught me that." The mention of Dad nearly broke what little composure I had left. I pressed my back against the marble counter, needing something solid to hold me upright. "You knew him well?"
Better than well. Roberto Santos saved my life in Afghanistan, 2003. We were pinned down by sniper fire, and your father crawled 50 yards through hostile territory to reach my position when I was wounded. His voice carried the weight of absolute truth. But that's not why I wanted to speak with you. I waited, afraid to hope, afraid to breathe. I've been watching you for years, Clara. Not in any inappropriate way, he added quickly, seeing my expression, but keeping an eye on Roberto's girls, making sure you were both finding your paths. Your mother doesn't know this, but I've been following your work. My work? The words came out cracked, uncertain. The Riverside Veterans Housing Project, the Emergency Assistance Fund for military families facing eviction, the job placement program for spouses dealing with PTSD. His eyes never left mine. Did you think that funding just appeared by magic? My knees nearly gave out. For 3 years, I'd been amazed by our program's ability to secure grants from anonymous donors, mysterious foundations that seemed to understand exactly what our families needed. That was you? That was you, he corrected firmly. I just made sure you had the resources to do what you were already doing, what you've been called to do since you were 15 years old and started volunteering at the base counseling center after your father died. Tears spilled down my cheeks, ruining my carefully applied makeup. I'd thought no one noticed, no one cared about the quiet work I did helping military families navigate the bureaucratic maze of benefits and services. My mother certainly never asked about it, never seemed interested in the families I'd helped avoid homelessness or the veterans I'd connected with mental health resources. Your mother's speech tonight, General Ramirez continued, his voice hardening slightly, was inexcusable, but it also gave me the opportunity I've been waiting for. What do you mean? Instead of answering directly, he moved toward the door. Come back to the reception, Clara. Trust me when I say this evening isn't over. Before I could ask what he meant, he was gone, leaving me alone with the scent of his cologne and a flutter of something that might have been hope. I splashed cold water on my face, trying to repair the damage to my makeup, and returned to the reception hall. The band was still playing, couples swaying on the makeshift dance floor while others lingered over coffee and wedding cake. But I could feel the weight of curious glances, the whispered conversations that stopped when I passed. Word of my mother's toast had spread through the room like wildfire. Miguel stood immediately when he saw me, his face tight, with barely controlled fury. Clara, we're leaving, right now. We can't leave our own wedding reception. Yes, we can, after what your mother just did. Mr. and Mrs. Alvarez, General Ramirez appeared beside us, somehow managing to move with surprising stealth for such a large man. Might I request the honor of a few words with your guests? Miguel looked confused, but something in the general's manner made him nod. Of course, sir. The general moved to the podium with the confidence of someone accustomed to commanding attention. He didn't need to call for quiet. Conversations died naturally as people recognized the presence of real authority. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice carrying easily through the now silent room. I hope you'll indulge an old soldier in sharing a few thoughts about tonight's celebration. From my seat at the head table, I could see my mother straightening with satisfaction. She was probably expecting him to reinforce her speech, to add his military credentials to her assessment of her disappointing daughter. She was about to learn how wrong she could be. 30 years ago, I served alongside Lieutenant Colonel Roberto Santos in some of the most challenging conditions our military has faced. He was a soldier's soldier, brave, principled, and absolutely devoted to his family. The general's gaze swept the room, landing briefly on each face. Roberto talked about his daughters constantly, how proud he was of both of them, how he saw in them the qualities that make not just good soldiers, but good human beings. I held my breath, not daring to hope. Now, Major Santos has certainly honored the family tradition through her military service, and we're all grateful for her dedication to our country. Polite applause followed his nod toward Lucia. But tonight, I want to talk about a different kind of service, a different kind of courage. The room went completely still. You see, I've been privileged to watch Clara Santos, now Clara Alvarez, demonstrate the exact qualities her father valued most, not on a battlefield, but in the quiet, steady work of rebuilding lives that war has damaged.
My mother's face had gone pale. Around the room, guests leaned forward, suddenly paying attention in a way they hadn't before. Some of you may not know that Clara has spent the last 5 years working with veterans' families, helping them navigate the complex systems designed to support those who've served our country. She's prevented dozens of military families from becoming homeless. She's connected struggling veterans with mental health resources. She's found jobs for military spouses who've sacrificed their own careers for their partner's service. The general's voice grew stronger, more commanding. But here's what makes Clara truly remarkable. She's never once asked for credit, never sought recognition, never expected applause. She simply saw people in need and found ways to help them,
one family at a time. I could barely breathe. Beside me, Miguel's hand found mine, his grip steady and warm. Roberto once told me that true courage isn't the absence of fear, it's doing what's right despite being afraid. Clara embodies that principle every single day. She may not wear a uniform, but she serves with the same honor, the same dedication, the same selfless commitment that defines the best of our military tradition. The silence in the room had changed quality, becoming charged with something like electricity. I could see guests exchanging glances, reassessing, reconsidering everything they thought they knew about the bride they'd dismissed as the disappointing daughter. The general raised his glass. So tonight I propose a toast, not to the bride who failed to meet expectations, but to Clara Alvarez, who has exceeded every measure of what it means to serve with honor. Captain Morrison, the same man who'd earlier praised Lucia's deployment record, stood and raised his glass. To Clara Alvarez. One by one, like dominoes falling in reverse, the entire room rose to their feet. To Clara Alvarez. The sound of my name echoed through the reception hall, spoken with respect, with recognition, with something I'd never heard from this crowd before, genuine admiration. My vision blurred with tears as I managed to stand, accepting the toast that felt like absolution. But the general wasn't finished. He continued, his voice cutting through the emotional atmosphere. If I may share one more story, he continued, his voice cutting through the emotional atmosphere. Last Christmas, I visited the Riverside Veterans Center. I wanted to see how our funding was being used and meet some of the families we were supporting. What I found was a young woman sitting on the floor of the community room, surrounded by 3 small children whose father was struggling with severe PTSD. My breath caught. I remember that day. Tommy Martinez's kids scared and confused by their father's nightmares, not understanding why Daddy sometimes screamed in his sleep. The children were drawing pictures, and this young woman, Clara, was helping them create a book about brave soldiers who sometimes need extra help to feel safe again. She wasn't just providing services or filling out paperwork. She was giving those children a way to understand and love their father despite his struggles. I closed my eyes, remembering little Sophia's drawing of a soldier holding a teddy bear, her careful explanation that even brave people need something soft to hold sometimes. When I asked Tommy Martinez about Clara later, he said she'd saved his family, not just with housing assistance or counseling referrals, but by showing his children that their father was still a hero even when he was hurting. That kind of healing, that's something you can't measure in medals or rank. That's something deeper. The room remained absolutely silent, every guest hanging on his words. Roberto Santos would be incredibly proud of the woman his daughter has become, not because she followed a predetermined path, but because she created her own path toward service, toward honor, toward making the world a better place, one family at a time. I looked across the room and saw faces I didn't recognize staring back at me. The same military guests who'd seemed so disinterested during Miguel's family's toasts, now looking at me with something approaching awe. Clara, the general said, turning to face me directly, your father once told me that the highest form of courage is the kind that nobody sees, the quiet heroism of showing up every day for people who need you, even when there's no recognition, no applause, no reward, except the knowledge that you've made a difference. He paused, and in that pause, I could almost hear my father's voice, feel his presence in the room. You have that courage. You've always had it. And anyone who can't see that, well, They're missing the most important part of who you are. The words hit like a physical force. Years of doubt and insecurity cracking open to let in light I'd forgotten existed. This was what it felt like to be truly seen, truly valued for who I was instead of who I wasn't. General Ramirez raised his glass one final time. To Clara Alvarez, who serves with honor, loves with courage, and makes her father proud every single day.
This time, the applause wasn't polite or obligatory. It was thunderous, genuine, sustained. People weren't just clapping for the bride anymore. They were celebrating a person they'd just discovered, recognizing values they'd overlooked, honoring service they'd never understood. Through the noise and emotion, I caught sight of my mother's face. The satisfaction from her earlier speech had vanished, replaced by something between shock and dismay. She was looking around the room as if seeing it for the first time, watching her carefully constructed narrative crumble in real time. Lucia, sitting beside her, was clapping too, but her expression was thoughtful, almost apologetic. For the first time in years, my sister was looking at me like she was seeing someone new. But it was Miguel's face that made my heart soar. He was beaming with pride and love, his eyes bright with tears he wasn't trying to hide. "That's my wife," I heard him say to no one in particular. "That incredible woman is my wife." General Ramirez stepped down from the podium and walked directly to our table. Without ceremony, he pulled me into a bear hug that smelled like aftershave and military precision. "Your father would be so proud," he whispered in my ear. "And Clara, you never needed anyone's permission to be extraordinary. You already were." As he released me, I felt something shift inside my chest, a loosening of knots I'd carried for so long I'd forgotten they were there. For 28 years, I'd been trying to earn my place in my family, to prove I was worthy of the Santos name despite choosing a different path. Tonight, I finally understood that I'd been approaching it backwards. The Santos name was worthy of me. The reception transformed after General Ramirez's speech. What had been polite but distant interactions became warm, genuine conversations as guests approached our table with new curiosity and respect. Colonel Patterson, who'd barely acknowledged me during the receiving line, spent 10 minutes asking detailed questions about our job placement program for military spouses. "I had no idea," he said, shaking his head. "My own daughter-in-law has been struggling to find work after 3 relocations. Would you be willing to speak with her?" "Of course," I replied, surprised by how natural it felt to discuss my work with someone who was actually listening, actually interested. "Have her call me next week." Similar conversations sprouted around the room. Captain Williams asked about our emergency assistance fund. His nephew's family had been facing eviction after a medical emergency. Major Chen wanted to know how other bases could implement similar programs. These were the same people who'd seemed bored during dinner, checking their phones and talking over civilian speeches about love and marriage. Now they were seeing military relevance in my work, understanding how community development translated to supporting the families that supported our service members. "This is incredible," Miguel murmured, squeezing my hand as we watched another cluster of officers deep in discussion about veteran services. Before I could respond, Mrs. Richardson appeared at my elbow, the same woman who'd hugged me warmly when I first arrived before my mother's criticism had driven her away. "Clara, dear, I owe you an apology," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "When Teresa spoke earlier, I'm ashamed to say I didn't know what to think. But now I understand what your father saw in you all those years ago." "What do you mean?" She smiled, her eyes twinkling with memory. "Roberto used to brag about you constantly at base social events. He'd tell anyone who'd listen about his daughter who had such a big heart, who always brought home stray animals and befriended the lonely kids at school. He said you were going to change the world one person at a time." My throat tightened. "He said that?" "Oh, honey, he never stopped talking about how proud he was of your compassion. He used to say that Lucia would serve our country in uniform, but Clara would serve humanity with her heart.
Looks like he was right about both his daughters. As Mrs. Richardson moved away, I noticed my mother standing alone near the dessert table, watching the animated conversation swirling around me with an expression I couldn't quite read. For the first time all evening, Teresa Santos looked uncertain, off balance. Our eyes met across the room. Instead of her usual critical assessment, I saw something that might have been confusion, even a flicker of regret. But before I could process it fully, she looked away, reaching for her purse with the practiced efficiency of someone preparing to leave. "She's going to slip out," Miguel observed, following my gaze, probably hoping to avoid any awkward conversations about her speech. Part of me wanted to let her go, to savor my vindication without having to deal with whatever complicated emotions my mother might be feeling. But another part, the part that had spent 5 years helping families heal from difficult conversations, knew that some things couldn't be left unsaid.
"I'll be right back," I told Miguel, rising from my chair. I intercepted my mother near the coat check, where she was quietly retrieving her wrap. "Leaving already?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. She turned, and for a moment, I saw past the careful composure to something raw underneath. "I think it's best. The evening has become complicated." "Complicated how?" Her hands stilled on her purse strap. "Clara, I never intended." "Yes, you did." The words came out more gently than I expected, without the anger I thought I'd feel. "You intended to remind everyone that I'm not Lucia, that I don't measure up to what you think the Santos family should be. You've been doing it my whole life." She was quiet for a long moment, looking down at her hands. When she finally spoke, her voice was smaller than I'd ever heard it. "Your father loved you so much," she said quietly. "Sometimes I think I resented how easy it was for him. He never worried about whether you were following the right path or making the right choices. He just loved you exactly as you were." The admission hung in the air between us, heavy with years of unspoken tension. "After he died, I felt like I had to be the disciplinarian, the one who kept you both on track. I was terrified of failing him, of letting his daughters become ordinary." "I was never going to be ordinary, Mom. Neither was Lucia. We were just going to be ourselves." She looked up at me then, really looked, and I saw tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "I heard what General Ramirez said tonight, about the families you've helped, the work you've done. I had no idea. Because you never asked. I said it without malice, just as a statement of fact. You never wanted to hear about my job because it wasn't the job you wanted for me." I was wrong. The words seemed to cost her something. Tonight proved I was very wrong. We stood there in the Kochek alcove, two Santos women who'd been at odds for so long we'd almost forgotten how to speak to each other without armor. I can't take back what I said earlier, but, Clara, watching those people tonight, seeing how they look at you now, your father would be so proud. And I should have been proud too, all along. It wasn't a complete apology. It wasn't a promise that everything would be different going forward, but it was acknowledgement, recognition, the first crack in a wall that had stood between us for 13 years. "Thank you," I said simply. She nodded, then surprised me by reaching out to touch my cheek gently. "You look beautiful tonight. I should have told you that when you walked down the aisle." "You're telling me now?" "Yes," she said, managing a small smile. "I'm telling you now." As I watched her walk toward the exit, I felt something settling in my chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but the possibility of it. Maybe that was enough for tonight. When I returned to the reception, the party was in full swing. The band had switched to more contemporary music, and couples filled the dance floor, while others gathered around tables sharing stories and laughter. But the energy had changed since the general's speech. There was warmth here now, genuine celebration instead of polite obligation. Miguel appeared at my side, handsome and slightly rumpled from dancing with various relatives. "How did it go?" "Better than expected. Not perfect, but better." He pulled me into his arms as the band began a slow song.
Ready to dance with your husband, Mrs. Alvarez? As we swayed together on the crowded floor, I felt the last of the evening's tension melting away. Around us, wedding guests chatted and laughed, several stopping to congratulate us again or share stories about their own military family experiences. But what struck me most was the way people were looking at me now, not as the disappointing daughter or the bride who didn't quite fit, but as Clara Alvarez, a woman worth knowing, worth celebrating, worth remembering. "Thank you," I whispered in Miguel's ear. "For what?" "For seeing me before anyone else did, for never making me feel like I had to be someone different to deserve love." He pulled back to look at me, his brown eyes serious. "Clara, you've never needed to be anyone but yourself. You're extraordinary exactly as you are."
As the song ended and we prepared for another round of congratulations and conversations, I caught sight of General Ramirez across the room. He raised his glass in a small, private toast, just for me, and I understood that this was what my father would have wanted for my wedding day. Not perfection, not a performance designed to impress others, just the recognition of who I really was, and the celebration of a life built on service, love, and quiet courage. The kind of courage that shows up every day, whether anyone's watching or not. The kind of courage I'd always had, even when I couldn't see it myself. The transformation in the reception hall was almost magical. Where earlier I'd felt the weight of judgmental stares and whispered comparisons, now I found myself surrounded by genuine warmth and curiosity. It was as if General Ramirez's speech had flipped a switch, revealing a completely different version of the evening, one where I belonged. "Clara, I had no idea about your work with the housing project," said Mrs. Patterson, the colonel's wife who'd barely acknowledged me during cocktails. She leaned forward with sincere interest. "My book club has been looking for a meaningful volunteer opportunity. Do you think we'd welcome the help?" I replied, still adjusting to being the center of positive attention. Emergency food preparation is always needed, and we could use help with childcare during counseling sessions. Captain Morrison appeared at my elbow, his earlier dismissiveness completely gone. "My sister's been trying to find work since her husband's deployment ended. 3 kids and no recent job experience. It's been rough. Could your program help?" "Absolutely. Have her call our office Monday morning." The requests kept coming. Veterans seeking resources for struggling family members, military spouses wanting to volunteer, officers asking how they could implement similar programs at other bases. Each conversation revealed another connection, another way my work intersected with their lives in ways they'd never realized. Miguel squeezed my hand as we navigated yet another introduction. "You're going to need business cards," he murmured with a proud smile. But the most meaningful reaction came from an unexpected source. Major Williams, a stern woman who'd spent dinner discussing deployment schedules with Lucia, approached our table with hesitant steps. "Mrs. Alvarez," she began formally, then paused and tried again. "Clara, I need to apologize. When I heard you worked in community development, I assumed, well, I made unfair assumptions about the value of civilian social work." She straightened as if delivering a difficult report. "My son attempted suicide last year. PTSD from his second tour. The counselor who talked him through his crisis, who helped our whole family understand what he was going through, she had the same background you do. Community development, social services. She saved his life." My throat tightened. I'm so glad he found help. "The point is, I dismissed your profession tonight because I didn't understand it. That was wrong of me, and it was exactly the kind of thinking that keeps struggling veterans from seeking help they need." Her voice grew stronger. "What you do? It's as important as anything happening in uniform." Across the room, I noticed other conversations shifting too. Lieutenant Davis was showing his wife photos on his phone. Pictures from our community center, he explained, where his nephew had participated in our youth mentorship program. Colonel Chen was describing our job placement success rates to a cluster of interested spouses. Even the military band had taken notice. During their break, the lead trumpet player approached to thank me for helping his brother-in-law navigate VA benefits after a training injury. Made all the difference in the world. The family was drowning in paperwork before you stepped in. The evening felt surreal, like watching a movie of someone else's life, a version where I was respected, valued, celebrated for exactly who I was, instead of criticized for who I wasn't. But perhaps the most significant change came when Lucia finally approached our table. My sister had been notably quiet since General Ramirez's speech, watching the room's reaction with thoughtful eyes. Now she stood beside my chair with uncharacteristic uncertainty. "Clara, I owe you an apology too." I looked up at her, surprised. Lucia never apologized. Not because she was cruel, but because she rarely admitted to being wrong about anything. "I've been part of the problem," she continued, her military bearings softening slightly. "All these years, I let Mom make you feel lesser because it made me feel more important. I stood by while she compared us, knowing it hurt you, because being the successful daughter felt good."
She paused, glancing around at the transformed reception. "But listening to General Ramirez tonight, seeing how these people look at you now, I realized I never really understood what you do. I never bothered to learn about your work because I was too busy being proud of mine." Her admission hung between us, raw and honest, in a way that was completely unlike my usually composed sister. "Lucia—" "No, let me finish," she interrupted gently. "What you've accomplished, the lives you've touched, it's remarkable, and I should have seen it years ago. I should have defended you to Mom, should have made her see what I'm seeing tonight." She reached down and squeezed my shoulder. "I'm proud to be your sister, Clara. I always have been, even when I didn't show it properly." Tears pricked to my eyes as I covered her hand with mine. "Thank you. That means more than you know." As Lucia returned to her seat, I felt another piece of the evening's healing fall into place. This wasn't just about proving my worth to strangers. It was about finally being seen clearly by the people who mattered most. As the evening wore on and the initial wave of congratulations began to settle, I found myself standing at the edge of the dance floor, watching Miguel spin his young niece in dizzy circles while she giggled with delight. The sight filled me with such contentment that I almost didn't notice when the bandleader approached. "Mrs. Alvarez," he said, holding a wireless microphone, "several guests have requested that you say a few words, if you're comfortable with that." The old Clara would have immediately declined, would have deflected attention back to others, would have found an excuse to avoid the spotlight. But tonight felt different. Tonight, I had something to say. "Yes," I heard myself answer. "I'd like that." Miguel looked up from his dance with his niece, catching my eye and nodding encouragingly. The bandleader called for attention, and gradually the room quieted as I stepped toward the small stage area. Standing there with the microphone in my hands, I looked out at faces that had transformed over the course of the evening. Military officers who'd dismissed me hours earlier now watched with genuine interest. Family friends who'd seemed uncomfortable during my mother's speech were leaning forward attentively. Even the servers had paused their work to listen. "Thank you all for being here tonight," I began, my voice steadier than I had expected. "When Miguel and I planned the celebration, we wanted to honor not just our love for each other, but the communities that shaped us, military and civilian, family and chosen family." I paused, finding General Ramirez in the crowd. He nodded encouragingly. "Earlier tonight, my mother called me a disappointment. For most of my life, I believed she was right. I thought because I didn't follow the expected path, because I chose community work over military service, I was somehow failing to honor my father's memory." My voice grew stronger. But General Ramirez helped me understand something crucial tonight. Service isn't about the uniform you wear or the title on your door. It's about showing up for people who need you, even when, especially when, no one's watching. I found Miguel's face in the crowd, drawing strength from his steady presence. "Every veteran we've helped find housing, every military spouse we've connected with employment, every child we've supported through a parent's deployment, that's been my honor to serve, not because I was seeking recognition, but because it was the right thing to do."
The room was completely silent now, every person focused on my words. My father taught me that true courage isn't the absence of fear, it's doing what's right despite being afraid. Tonight, I want to stop being afraid of disappointing people who refuse to see my value. I want to stop apologizing for choosing compassion over conformity. I took a breath, feeling years of self-doubt finally loosening their grip. So, thank you, General Ramirez, for reminding me that I've always been enough. Thank you to every person here who's taken the time tonight to really see the work I do, to understand that there are many ways to serve our country and our communities. I turned toward where my mother had been sitting, remembering our conversation by the code check. And thank you, Mom, for finally hearing me, even if it took 30 years. I know Dad would be proud of both his daughters, not for being the same, but for finding our own ways to make a difference. The microphone trembled slightly in my hands as I prepared for my final words. Miguel, thank you for loving me exactly as I am, for never making me feel like I needed to be different to deserve your heart. And to everyone here, thank you for celebrating not just our marriage, but the reminder that we all serve in different ways, and every act of genuine service matters.
I handed the microphone back to the band leader as applause erupted throughout the room. But this time, I didn't just accept it politely. I stood tall and owned it, let it wash over me like recognition I'd always deserved, but never dared to claim. Miguel reached me first, pulling me into a kiss that tasted like champagne and triumph. "That was incredible," he whispered against my lips. "You were incredible." As the applause died down and conversations resumed, I noticed my mother hadn't returned to her seat after our conversation by the coat check. For a moment, I wondered if she'd left entirely, unable to witness the complete reversal of her carefully constructed narrative about her disappointing daughter. Then I spotted her, standing alone near the far wall, partially hidden behind one of the decorated columns. She was watching the reception with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger or disapproval, but something closer to bewilderment, as if she had walked into the wrong event entirely. "She looks lost," Mikkel observed, following my gaze. Before I could respond, Mrs. Richardson approached my mother with what appeared to be pointed intent. Even from across the room, I could see the tension in my mother's posture as the older woman spoke, gesturing occasionally toward me. "This can't be good," I murmured. But as their conversation continued, something interesting happened. Other guests began gravitating toward them, not to support my mother, but to add their own comments to whatever Mrs. Richardson was saying. Colonel Patterson joined the growing cluster, his wife nodding emphatically as she spoke. Major Williams added her voice to the discussion. My mother stood in the center of it all, her usual commanding presence diminished as she was forced to listen to perspective after perspective about my work, my character, my value to the community. "She's being held accountable," Miguel said quietly. "They're making sure she understands exactly what she tried to dismiss tonight." Lucia appeared beside us, her expression unreadable as she watched our mother's public reckoning. "How do you feel about that?" I asked my sister. Lucia was quiet for a moment. "She needed to hear it," she said finally. "Mom spent so long controlling the narrative about our family, deciding who measured up and who didn't. Maybe it's time she learned what other people really think." As if sensing our attention, my mother looked across the room and our eyes met. For a second, I saw the woman behind the perfectionist facade, tired, uncertain, perhaps even ashamed. Then Mrs. Richardson reclaimed her attention with another pointed comment. "Should I rescue her?" I found myself asking. "From the consequences of her own cruelty?" Lucia shook her head. "Clara, you're too kind. Let her sit with this for a while. Let her understand what it feels like to be judged and found wanting." But watching my mother's increasingly isolated position, I felt an unexpected pang of sympathy. Yes, she'd humiliated me publicly. Yes, she had spent years making me feel inadequate. But she was still my mother, still the woman who'd raised me and Lucia alone after Dad died, still someone who was learning, finally, belatedly, that her version of family success had been unnecessarily narrow. The cluster around my mother was beginning to disperse, the point apparently made. She stood alone again, looking smaller somehow, her earlier confidence completely evaporated. I'm going to talk to her, I decided. Mikkel caught my arm gently. Are you sure? You don't owe her comfort after what she did tonight. I don't owe her anything, I agreed. But I want to do this. Not for her, for me. I crossed the room slowly, giving myself time to think about what I wanted to say. By the time I reached my mother, I felt centered, clear about my intentions. Mom? She turned, and I saw that her eyes were red-rimmed, whether from tears or frustration, I couldn't tell. Clara. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I suppose you heard all that. Some of it. I kept my tone neutral. How are you feeling? She let out a bitter laugh. Like a fool, like someone who spent years missing what was right in front of her face. She looked around the reception hall, taking in the clusters of guests, still discussing my work with animated enthusiasm. They all knew about what you do, about how much it matters. Everyone except your own mother. You could have known, I said gently. I would have told you if you'd ever asked. I know. The admission seemed to cost her. I was so focused on what I thought success should look like that I couldn't see the success you actually achieved. We stood in silence for a moment, watching Miguel dance with his grandmother while his cousins cheered them on. I'm proud of you, my mother said suddenly. I should have said that years ago, but I'm saying it now. I'm proud of the woman you've become, and I'm sorry it took a public embarrassment for me to see it clearly. It wasn't a perfect apology. It didn't erase years of criticism and comparison, but it was honest, and it was hers, and it was enough for this moment. Thank you, I said. That means more than you know. She nodded, then surprised me by reaching out to straighten a strand of my hair, a gesture so maternal and gentle that it reminded me of being small, of bedtime stories and scraped knees, and the mother who'd loved me before disappointment became her default language. Go, she said, stepping back. Go dance with your husband. Enjoy your triumph. You've earned every bit of it. As I walked back toward the dance floor, I felt the last piece of the evening's healing click into place. Not forgiveness, that would take time, but the possibility of rebuilding something better from the ruins of what we'd been. Hours later, as the last guests filtered out into the night air, I stood in the center of the empty reception hall, still wearing my wedding dress, but feeling like a completely different person than the nervous bride who'd arrived that morning. Miguel wrapped his arms around me from behind, and we swayed together without music, surrounded by the remnants of our celebration, scattered rose petals, empty champagne glasses, and the lingering warmth of recognition finally received. How does it feel? He whispered in my ear. I smiled, thinking of General Ramirez's final words as he left. You lived up to your father's honor in ways medals could never measure. Thinking of the business cards now tucked in my purse from military families wanting help. Thinking of my mother's quiet, I'm proud of you, and Lucia's overdue apology. It feels like coming home to myself, I answered. For the first time in my life, I didn't need anyone's permission to be proud of who I was. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.